And I showed some of this yesterday, but I want to reboot a little bit. This is what Zalitsky, her imaging, is finding off Cuba here. These are the monuments, which largely look like roads and pyramids. She claimed sphinxes, and I'm going to read directly from her interview tonight. We're going to hear her voice in her own words, which is something always remarkable. You know, there's a lot of interpretation, but it's always nice to hear the actual quote. I do feel when I look at these ruins that it's a staggering find, and it completely uproots and upends history, because if a major culture, a pyramid-making culture, and the type of advanced knowledge and tools that are involved with that culture sank to a depth of 2,200 feet in some ancient period of our past, that completely changes all of the history that we know. That's why Atlantis it's one of the reasons why Atlantis is such a hot potato. Atlantis Rising is a real hot potato. That's more of the graphic imaging. We always try to find more here, but this is kind of the interpretation of the submersible unit that they sent down, because it's so far down there that at 2,200 feet, you're not going to get normal divers to do anything. And again, a lot of researchers found it interesting that Zalitsky didn't make it. You know, it's like as soon as she goes to this cave, all of those ruins open up. It's quite unusual. Maybe that's it was just kismet, you know, but certainly it made some people wonder. Okay, I have read. Now, Zalitsky, she studied engineering in the Soviet Union and oceanography, and was assigned to work on a secret submarine base in Cuba during the Cold War. She eventually defected to Canada. She met her current husband, businessman Paul Zweinzig. Now, the couple own and operate a company called Advanced Digital Communications. And again, this is Paulina Zalitsky, who found the Cuban city there. So Zalitsky reports that at about 2,200 feet off Cuba's western tip, she's found a huge land plateau with clear images of what appear to be man-made, large-size architectural designs, partly covered by sand. From above, the shapes resemble pyramids, roads, and buildings, quote unquote. Okay, so here's some of the QA that she's had with Linda and AP. Is there anything that you can say on the record this morning that I can do some kind of an update? For the record, you can say that the Center for Marine Archaeology and Anthropology at the Cuban Academy of Science is currently analyzing video data that we have from the perimeter of the site from megalithic stones. They're working on inscriptions that they have detected on the stones and are analyzing them at the time. What are the estimated size of these stones? The estimated size of these stones, they are roughly about 2 by 5 meters, very large stones. That's about 6 feet by 15 or 16 feet, something like that. 6 feet on each of the 4 sides and 16 feet high. So they go into a little bit about how the stones look like Stonehenge. On these stones, where are the possible inscriptions? They are not anywhere specific on the stones, these inscriptions. They could be in the middle of the stones, various parts of the stones across. One thing we found, the anthropologist found, was an American cross. It's a Central American cross. I found the references go here to extegonography, and we'll see as we get along. Is that where 2 lines are crossed perpendicular to each other? No, they're not 2 lines. They're oval shapes crossing each other. Okay, so this goes on. There's a description there. And they talk a little bit about the process of getting down there. And so they get asked, have they made any comments, the people that the museum that's trying to analyze the carved inscriptions, have they made any comments about the symbols or carvings? And Zalitsky answers, Greek-like inscriptions. Greek-like? Well, hieroglyphic-like inscriptions. Hieroglyphic like Egypt? I said the lettering is Greek-like. Hold on just a minute. Why don't you talk to my boss? Okay, so Pauline Zalitsky goes forward here, and she says, "I'm so happy to meet you," so on. Okay, so they have another conversation. Now, this is a second interview. And so they try to clarify some things about, are these Greek inscriptions that you're seeing? And she says, "No, I was overhearing, and I don't want you to make any bad mistakes mixing Greek. That was my husband's mistake." So the husband apparently in reports had given these interviews saying they look like Greek. And she says, "No, because it's not Greek. It has the same tendency, but it's not Greek. We don't know what it is, and scientists are trying to decipher it." Right, it has some resemblance. This is the question now. It has some resemblance to the lettering of Greek, but it's not Greek. Are there some pictographs that would fall into the hieroglyphic category as well? Now, this is Zalitsky. Yes, and symbols as well. There are different signs, more like American nature, they have found in Central America. Pyramids, strong delineation of the structures which suggest pyramidal type. American pyramidal type, not Egyptian pyramidal type. So they're finding Mayan pyramids, not Egyptian classic Great Pyramids, that kind of thing. And she clarifies it and so on. Then she said, "Are the caves underwater around the island, is that where the American cross has been found carved?" Yes, and other symbology, other cosmic type depictions. And you find this in Cuban caves around the island, not only in the north, but in the south. These caves are underwater caves. One of the cave I know of is on land and has this type of symbology as well. So they go off about the caves for a little bit. But what I wanted to really point out there is that she's giving us this impression of what these different symbols look like. And Zalitsky wanted to show the crossed oval symbol and the spirals. So the image is from the Cuban Isle of Youth and restored by archaeologists, but there are a number of similar Cuban caves. That is the cross that she's referring to, that is showing up in the caves, but is also present there under the water in the ruins that she's seeing. And then here we have again, that is Zalitsky looking up at the ruins in the cave. So I think what's pretty clear from that is that Zalitsky is confirming for this much on the record, that not only has she seen the pyramids and she's related sphinxes and roads. Now, and the sphinxes do sound more Greek Egyptian, of course, than the Mayans. But the pyramids are clearly Mayan, and the structures look Mayan or Central American. The hieroglyphs are definitely Central American Mayan variety. So when we think of it this way, this culture is that kind of Poseidian culture that was there in Atlantis. When that sank, they were the ones who dispersed to the Inca and the Maya and that whole area. That's why it's so much more like that. But I think what she's confirming for us there on the record also is that she's seen some of the very same carvings and images like that cross and the spiral above ground in the caves as she's seen on the ruins below. That's crucial because it means that these two pieces were connected at one point. And I think what we're getting there is she's confirming on the record the extent of the ruins and the analysis that they were doing at the time, and that they had pictures that could go close up and look at inscriptions where you could actually identify things like hieroglyphics. So we've gone way beyond the stage of strange anomalies appearing in the water that might be a mound or might be whatever. She's looking at inscriptions. So in a way, the cat's already out of the bag. The question is, why are we in this strange twilight zone of radio silence about it? Now, the big story out of Cuba, these people with concussions. We're not getting anything about this story. But we do have this unusual story about Ernest Hemingway and the vault that was taken out of Cuba, presumably because he was looking for the same thing. So we can see that we're right at the very heart of this Atlantis Rising story. And it brings us into Zalitsky's work. It crisscrosses with what the Hemingways were after. And remember this also, that Les Hemingway is reported to be the first one to see those ruins and put them on the record. So he was flying over Cuba and saw it, basically, identified it. Later, they get Zalitsky over there, and the Russians do this weird thing to get her over there. They pull a ruse that they need her to study ocean currents. And they're expecting she's going to be able to do this. And instead, she defects to Canada. And somehow, some 30 years after this defection, Castro welcomes her back to Cuba and has her as the lead team doing this oceanography work, finding these ruins, under the ruse that she's looking for pirate ships. So you can see this is a very deep, convoluted situation about Atlantis rising off of Cuba. And it all goes back to the thing that Edgar Casey was telling us, which is that these ruins are on the rise, and it's something that you're going to see the first inklings of in this area of Bimini in 68. But apparently it's the whole region that's going to rise, and there will be land appearing off the East Coast. I believe that these movements are going to be undeniable at a certain point, and that this whole term about disclosure, it's going to be pretty obvious on the Atlantis side what we see, because it's going to be something where anyone who has the ability to look geographically underwater will see these things rising. And we know that there are people looking that are beyond just the nation states that are involved. So we've got a pretty dramatic situation unfolding there. And if we can get our handle on the Hemingway aspect of it and how that sparked this national security memo and how that put pressure on these families and how this whole process works, we're going to understand what the Atlantis Rising aspect is all about. And again, it goes back over and over again to the mystery school influence coming off of people like Steiner and Casey, informing the public this stuff's about to happen. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'm going to show everyone here the Andros platform, because I mentioned that. Oh, this is the island of Andros off there, and that's where we're finding that strange underwater anomaly, which I have to say looks just like the Bimini Road. I would say it's basically the same kind of thing. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Okay.
It is compelling when we think about how all this comes together. And here's the timeline. I'm going to sort of lay out a real skeleton nutshell version of how this works. In 1930, you've got Thomas Townsend Brown, and he goes to Cuba doing these secret experiments of deep submersion. And his follow-up career to that will be loaded with all of these black projects, including what looks to be something along the lines of time travel technology and electrogravitics and things of this nature. Very, very deep secret projects. But it all starts when he goes to Cuba, and as soon as he gets there, there's a massive earthquake. Now, Thomas Townsend Brown, we've covered in other programs, but what's interesting is when we get into any time that Einstein spends himself in the Hotzone. He's in Florida a lot, but I wanted to find him right in the center of things. And after doing some digging, in fact, I did. No great surprise. He was down there, and there are newspaper reports in 1930, where he is doing these visiting going on down there in Cuba. And what's happening was quite fascinating. He's down there, and while he's down there, Hubble, who will create the Hubble telescope for Caltech, those guys get together. So it's an astronomy visit, which is also kind of strange. And also it's unplanned. So it's a surprise visit. And that could have been for assassination prevention purposes, because when Einstein went to America and stayed in Pasadena, the first thing that happened to him when he was at Caltech was a car tried to run him over. And he, the description is that he did a somersault to get out of the way. Now, under ordinary circumstances, you could say, oh, it was just a car accident, whatever, the people took off. But when you are the top scientist in the world, it's, fundamentally, you assume it's an assassination attempt. All right. This is the visit that he makes there. And he meets the top people there. He's got the Secretary of State in Cuba. And the visit itself is unusual, and he spends most of his time with the Secretary of State and with Hubble. And so the nature of him being there and the nature of that mission has been shrouded in secrecy, but he spends a good deal of time there. And what ends up happening is he starts to form this tight bond when he's in America with someone who will become the person who is the executor of his will when he dies. And this person, he forwards the correspondence, Dr. Otto Nathan, between himself and Charles Hapgood. Now, here's what's interesting when you are familiar with the Hotzone episodes that we've done. If you know of a little episode that we have that's called The Colonel in the Hotzone, this is one of the real hardcore important episodes in the whole Hotzone series because it ties in Kentucky Fried Chicken. And there's a whole huge corporate conglomerate piece associated with the Hotzone. But what happened there is that the Colonel's daughter, Margaret Sanders, came forward and led the Looking for Casey's Ruins of Bimini. And she had been a member of the ARE, and she had grown up in Kentucky. And my guess is that because Casey had grown up in Kentucky, that's how she discovered him. But she got totally fascinated and wanted to find the ruins of Atlantis and Bimini, and actually moved to Bimini and worked there. What would happen later is that her son was part of the original group finding the Bimini Road, although it was, and that's Trig Adams, who I've spoken to and who we may yet get on the program. We're in talks with him, but you know, he's there and then he disappears on his boat in the Hotzone. What's interesting about him is that he was pretty young when all this happened, but his mother had a group called MARS, and they were the ones that Valentine was associated with. And Valentine, J. Manson Valentine, was a Yale oceanographer who was aware that, you know, of this Casey prediction and went over the ruins and found the wall. So the fundamental prediction on Casey's side, the sleeping prophet Edgar Casey, was that right off the coast of Bimini was a temple of Poseidia, which was like the last outpost of the Atlantis great continent, and that it was incredibly advanced and that it was rising, that the land was rising and it was going to become visible. And so he said, expected in 68 or 69, not so far away. And he makes that prediction in 1943. Well, Manson Valentine finds it right after Trig Adams and his mother have found all these links to it. They're just about to announce their discovery. But Manson Valentine gets to it first, and then he decides, oh, I'm not part of Mars anymore. I'm doing my own thing. As I'd like to point out about Manson Valentine, a lot of his work went black afterwards, including the fact that he was looking for pyramids in South Florida. Now, and by all accounts, it looks like, based on some letters that are left in a museum, that he found them. But what happened, and what I think is crucial about him, is that he was best friends with Morris K. Jessup. And Jessup, on the UFO file front, the Philadelphia experiment, all of those things, was kind of like the real educated statesman. And he's the guy who comes in and he's giving UFOs a very legitimate path. And this is 56 and 57. So in 1958, he's found in a park, and you know, he's run the carbon monoxide into his car and committed suicide after, you know, no depression, nothing. But the person he was going to see was his best friend, Manson Valentine. Well, 10 years later, Manson Valentine shows up and he is discovering the Bimini Wall off the coast of Bimini, right there in the Hotzone. Now, I'm going to do a little walk down memory lane here for a moment, because the Hotzone and how we get into that is we've presented on this program since 2018 evidence that that area, by certain groups that are mapping the ocean floor or studying minerals, or are members of the military, are under an NDAA and under court-martial, that they cannot reveal what they find if they go into that area of the Hotzone. So if they see like the Temple of Isis down there, you can't mention anything to the press or you're going to jail. So this was a weird thing to discover in my own research. But the hot zone, and that they had a name for it, and that everyone seemed to have some name that was associated with hot zone, so that when I went to regular kind of well-known Atlantis researchers and people of this ilk, and I said things to them like, have you ever heard of the hot zone? And they would say like, well, I've heard of this, like, so it was all this similar stuff. So obviously for people who are in the know, the hot zone is something that they have to deal with on a regular basis. So the hot zone, fundamentally, that area off the western tip of Cuba, all the way over to Bimini and then the Yucatan Peninsula, that area has been a hotbed of geopolitical infighting. Everything from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Venezuela issue, where Cuba and Venezuela were against the United States. And so when we look at these issues, we see that there was something more going on than just political tensions. Why did the Russians really risk everything to get in there, to get into Cuba? So there's a bigger backstory, and certainly President Kennedy's involvement with Cuba is also bigger, and gets into the fact that the Kennedy Library is now the #1 holder of any Ernest Hemingway document. They hold 95% of every material related to Ernest Hemingway's writings. That's pretty remarkable. Basically, what we're talking about is somebody who controls the entire estate. And so when you go to the Kennedy Library, what you're dealing with is the Ernest Hemingway legacy of astronomical data. So they'd gotten pretty deep by 1952. And the government that was running Cuba was the Batista government, which was corrupt, but was in deep with the Americans. So the Americans kind of let them run it the way that they would, as long as they allowed them to be in there. When the revolution came, which was a surprise apparently to the deep state and to the Americans, such a surprise that they tried to infiltrate Castro's government to see what was going on there, and they still didn't get a handle on it. That revolution took them so by surprise that all their plans for what they were doing there in relation to these ruins and the things that were being discovered got thrown out. And they realized when Castro took over that now he was going to be the one in charge of that entire landmass and the area around it. So this became a huge problem for them. So the deep state aspect of the problem, that is that the deep state wanted to use Cuba as part of their dominance of the Western Hemisphere, doesn't add up in terms of the types of risks that were taken and the nukes and everything else that came about as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's something deeper. There's some piece of it, just like there's some piece with Hemingway and the Finca Bahia, that doesn't make sense that it rises to this level of a national security crisis. So I think we have to look deeper. Certainly the geopolitical reasons can be deep, but I think for the impact of it, now that we understand that they were looking for Atlantis about 10 years earlier in Cuba, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, puts this entire thing in much better perspective. And this is what Sykes was getting at. But what's interesting to me is that Sykes decided that the best place to find Atlantis ruins would be Cuba and off Cuba. He was the one who was deep, deep in there. And for him, I think to go in that direction is quite fascinating. He does a lot in here about the... it seems like when you see the threads between the people who are operating in the hot zone, it seems like there's an association early, 1930. So I find the presence of Einstein and T.T. Brown there in Cuba so early on is a definite indicator. But we know also that Hemingway and JFK are the group that comes after that. So we've got this early setup, and then we have the ongoing piece. But one of the things about that yacht, the Caroline, and the secret mission that Thomas Townsend Brown is on is when he gets on that ship and he's talking to the captain, this billionaire who's just, God knows what he's actually doing there. But he brings out a perfectly pristine original copy of Alice in Wonderland, and it's in a glass casing. And one of the things that Thomas Townsend Brown asks him when he does this is, what is the casing? What's this all about? And he said, well, don't you understand? If the ship goes down, Alice in Wonderland goes on. So there's all sorts of, considering the work that Thomas Townsend Brown would go on to do, including being associated with the UFO file, the Philadelphia experiment, deep projects, and even time travel experiments, his setup there and Cuba, it shows again right in the heart of it. Let's not forget the colonel himself went to Cuba. It's one of the first things that he does when he's 19 years old, and he goes there as a soldier. So we know that there's some mystery operative, and it seems like Cuba is sort of the fingerprint of the whole thing as we get into it. And it's usually Cuba, Bimini, Florida. It's something in that range. One of the other things I want to mention is, a lot of people, including Lindbergh, for example, have pointed out what they were doing in their spare time when they weren't being Supermen. One of the things that Lindbergh did was he photographed ruins from above of Yucatan. This group of people, they're all clued in to the fact that there's something going on there. What did they do with Gordon Arnold? They had him go up there and look down below at Cuba and what was under Cuba. And the official explanation was, you're looking for nuclear this or nuclear that. And then he would say, I remembered Spanish galleons. And I've said before many times, Spanish galleons is the code word for there's ruins down there. But since you haven't said, I saw a pyramid of Giza down there, you can't get taken to court or whatever. So whenever you hear the Spanish galleons things, yes, there's incredible treasure and there's all these types of things. And there are people who just do that treasure hunting and do it quite well. But Spanish galleons has become the code word. So when we get into a period, let's take the T.T. Brown thing in 1930. Now let's sweep it up to 2001. And what happens? Fidel Castro brings in Paulina Zalitsky, who was in Cuba but defected to Canada and created her own undersea mapping program. And they say, we want you for Spanish galleon work. And they don't want her for that. They want her for the city. And she discovers a whole city off the western tip of Cuba, as we know when we follow the Hotzone episodes. And it's a massive discovery. And eventually she's pushed out, even thrown in a Mexican prison for a little while to really keep her, out of the flow of things. So whatever was going on was definitely too hot to handle. But when she sent her deep sea submersibles off the western tip of Cuba, it wasn't like they were looking at a building or even the Bimini Wall, as grand as that is. She said it was a metropolis. There's an entire city off the coast of the western tip of Cuba. That's the problem. And this is also noted by Hemingway's brother when he's flying over Cuba. He sees the exact same thing in the early 50s. So it's like an inside secret. And this is why we need to figure out what people on this level were doing with it. Now, I've posited two groups at a really high level relating to UFO information. One of them being X-Protect, which is a group that will do anything to keep the secret, and the other one being X-Share, which I think people like Thomas Brown and JFK emulate quite well. And their idea is to move the culture forward by informing them and having nations work together on this thing and all the rest. These other groups, the X-Protect groups, basically want to keep the information for themselves. They thrive on disinformation. And they also thrive on completely destroying reputations and destroying careers. That's what they're really good at. In extreme cases, like Morris Jessup, they just had to get rid of him because he knew too much. So that's what you're dealing with there. And it's always, the X-Protect group is always associated around aerospace and the intelligence groups, the deep, covert wing of the CIA. So, but that thing has been run into. Even Jim Garrison, when he was investigating President Kennedy's murder, he ran into it. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he's like, there's all this weird aerospace and UFO stuff around these people. What is that about? And that's where you're getting hot. And by the way, when we talk about the hot zone, we might be talking about Atlantis and Atlantis ruins and things of this nature. But in essence, what you're really looking at is incredible waves of UFO activity, so common in Bimini that they refer to them as fireflies. So, there's intense activity around the UFO file dealing particularly in the hot zone. So that's something for us to keep in the back of our heads as we're moving forward. Okay, I'll take about 15 more minutes on this and then we'll jump to questions. Is that
sure.
reasonable? All right. Do you have anything?
Karen Carpenter wants to know, does DJ see factions in the Kennedy family as far as Hemingway, X-Protect, etc.?
There's no question that, RFK Jr. is an incredible truth teller, and there are people in his family who are trying to take him down for truth telling. But I think that's more because they've been convinced that, not to be controversial and things of this nature. So yeah, there's a lot of programming, unfortunately. And I think we have to be really thankful that we have someone like RFK Jr. out there. We've had him on the program. He's coming back on the program. And, we're going to see some very interesting developments from things that he's working on. But this is somebody who is really one to watch in the middle of all this because of the incredible courage that he's showing, carrying on the family legacy dramatically and addressing the deep state assassinations very honestly. His family before that, the traditional thing was to say, well, the Warren Commission, and everyone knew that that was a lie. And he came out and said, well, my father never bought the Warren Commission. And by the way, when I investigated my father's assassination, it was not Sirhan Sirhan that did it. So that's very brave to bring that on record. Another GFK piece, I did mention the Ernest Hemingway part. I just want to kind of round that out so we understand it. And for those of you familiar with the Hot Zone episodes, you're going to be familiar with this segment, but I want to get this when we think about Babbitt, when we think about Hapgood, when we think about Einstein, when we think about the Colonel's daughter. I want this Hemingway piece to get in there because now we're starting to fill out the picture of what's actually operative out there in the hot zone. Okay, that is a shot of President Kennedy, and he is with Mary Hemingway after the death, which was originally claimed to be Hemingway cleaning his gun. And Hemingway the night before had said he felt federal agents were chasing him. Something very strange was going on with Ernest. But there's Mary, and she goes to Kennedy and says, there's a huge vault in Cuba, and I want to get it back. And trust me, you want to get it back too. Now, the traditional official story is, it was his poems and some extra manuscripts. But what happens later is in 2015, a national security document becomes unclassified, and it states that President Kennedy spoke with his CIA director, Robert Kennedy, who was the attorney general at the time, and Ed Lansdale, who was like a kind of a deep operative there for the Air Force and the CIA, covert ops. And the idea was it was for a major foreign policy risk to take place at Hemingway's villa in Cuba after his death. They were going to go there, and there was some incident that they were contemplating. Every one of those JFK researchers and historians like Arthur Schlesinger and all those people associated with the Kennedy legend, they're like, we have no idea what that is. So it only makes sense if Hemingway had something very secret that he had kept there. And what happens is they end up smuggling his legacy out of Cuba on a shrimp boat. But somebody's paid off to look the other way. That's the only way I can think about that one. But it's a matter of record. This is Smithsonian covering it. I mean, it's not even like you have to go very deep to find that 2 inches, that something weird was going on and that Mary Hemingway had done all this singing and dancing to make it happen. Now, there's a guy named Bill Walton who was really close to Hemingway and also a big honcho in the Kennedy circles. This is the guy that I've pegged as the intermediary for a long history between Hemingway and JFK. And there's lots of different places I guess we can go with that. But what I want to point out about it specifically is that it relates to this activity that was going on there, which is a geopolitical hotbed of intrigue having to do with the hot zone. And that's why Ernest Hemingway is there on Bimini. That's why Hemingway's family is so close with the Caseys. And that's why JFK is willing to risk a national security incident to get Hemingway's vault. It's not for some poems, I can tell you that. So, and why is all that Hemingway stuff there at the JFK library? We need to keep the Hemingway piece in there with the Einstein piece when we start to put these the real threads together, because it's going to make a lot more sense about what their activities were, because there are always weird stories about Hemingway going up and down between Bimini and Cuba and surveying the ocean floor. And whenever they asked him, what are you doing? He would say, I'm looking for German U-boats. But the boat that he had was set up for scientific survey. There were no guns on it. If he found a U-boat, what was he going to do except get blown out of the water? It doesn't make any sense. What he was doing was what his brother was doing, who was also a submarine journalist in that era. And the brother also has a history of going to Bimini before Ernest. He goes in 1930. Now, you could say Bimini was a lovely little island, but I think the fact that Casey is saying, hey, there's going to be a Poseidon temple coming up here, and the fact that, you know, these people are there, and then suddenly they're in Cuba and they're putting things away, and then when they escape, they leave behind this huge vault. We have to look at some of those connecting dots to get a picture of what was really happening down there. That's going to help us a lot. Okay, Babbitt. Let's get into this a little bit. So Elwood Babbitt is important in the story because he becomes kind of like a surrogate Casey in all this. And he would go into trance as Casey did, and he could bring forward different types of revelations. And it appears that in the second part of his life, now that he was being used by Hapgood on a regular basis, and they actually built Babbitt helped build a community in Western Mass that were all about farming and all this stuff. And eventually that all went away. But interestingly enough, it was Hapgood's cousin, Beth, who also had very big government connections. And she was the one who was really kind of creating this group that was very much associated with, you know, having a wonderful self-promoting, self-sustaining community, things of this nature. So we have these threads that are going on there. And Babbitt, basically in trance, is giving Hapgood some answers around his pole shift idea and saying, you know, these are things that are coming in the future, and a lot of your work is a setup work, and also telling him to use his own psychic ability. And on the record, Hapgood says that he had this incredible psychic experience which set him off on this track, where he remembered a lifetime of being in Vishnu's temple. Now, this is really heavy duty. Consider the scientific world that he's operating in. And then he comes out with this huge revelation. Well, you know, what's happening is I'm having these really extraordinary memories of being in the Vishnu temple, and how this was a very spiritual, incredible, you know, kind of level of memory of me. And he comes to regard his spiritualism to the forefront going forward after all these periods. And he's coming out and he's saying, you know what? I believe that we can solve these things through spiritual endeavor. And so Babbitt kind of takes him in this very interesting direction, and he discovers kind of like his own version of Casey in this era. One of the interesting things, again, when we go back to Einstein coming to Cuba and studying astronomy and being there with Hubble, eventually got the Hubble telescope, is there were there in Cuba these very ancient astronomical signs. And the person who goes to check them out and study them before she discovers the Cuban city is our friend Paulina Zalitsky. And it is in those caves, some of the oldest drawings there in the Hotzone, but they talk about a really heavy-duty cosmological incident that took place, and it's a record of that. And so, interestingly enough, Zalitsky was locked into this. Just a quick background again, so we understand the city that she discovered that's what we're talking about here. And she found it off the western tip of Cuba. And she said it was large, like a metropolis. And we can see from these over here, that whole thing is just, pyramids. And, I think really any deep investigation of those ruins is going to reveal something truly remarkable. However, you have all this kind of firefighting going on between the Cubans who own that and the United States are trying to get at it. And from what I understand, China and Russia and a lot of other people are trying to get at those ruins as well. Earlier, we mentioned Jacques Cousteau's granddaughter and how she was targeted by the Epstein-Maxwell gang. That is Alexandra Cousteau. And there's no question that they had basically set her up and we're trying to get compromising material on her. She stands out pretty mightily if you look at Virginia Giuffre's testimony. She's the one who doesn't make sense because what we're looking at is somebody who is not on the level of Bill Clinton, is not on the level of Lex Wexner, any of these guys. She is basically just, the granddaughter of this major figure whose big quest was Atlantis. So when we're starting to kind of put these together, we start to see Cousteau and the revelation that she was targeted by this group is a big key. It's something we didn't have until that deposition came out against Prince Andrew. You see how the information around the Hotzone works. If you get one piece in there, just like the Marvin Minsky piece, which Giuffre brought out as well, then we're able to connect all these other dots, including that huge dot with the Colonel's daughter. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. So just a little more background on this. Lester Hemingway. Lester Hemingway sets up New Atlantis. Lester Hemingway, the Hemingway is connected to Casey. Casey giving the readings on Atlantis, saying Atlantis is rising off Bimini. Crucial piece for us to understand. This is the spot he's pointing to where Atlantis is going to rise on the map. He founds New Atlantis. He writes up all these documents. He sends a letter to LBJ about it. And LBJ writes back saying, we hope to support your efforts to create this new nation, whatever, really unusual stuff. Eventually, the government boots him out and destroys the things. He set up a bunch of these kind of wooden rafts, and these platforms along a particular area. And they get wrecked and ruined. And then the government says, we don't like what you're doing. Get out of there. But Hemingway was deeply involved in this. And then we've outlined in a series of Hotzone shows how Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, when he's going between Bimini and Cuba, and he's on this boat that's all scientifically hooked up, and people will ask him, what are you doing on this boat? Can't all be fishing. Like, what are you spending all your time observing? What he's looking at are ruins. And this will be the Cuban city that ocean engineer Polina Zalitsky finds in 2001. And she finds it while she's in Cuba, and Cuba hires her. She actually defects. It's a very interesting story with her because she's behind the Soviet Union, and then she goes to Cuba, and then she defects to Canada. And she's, quite an interesting expert. And then her company that she puts together in Canada handles all of these different types of underwater mapping. And so Castro hires her supposedly to look for Spanish galleons. Spanish galleons is cover, in my opinion, for Hotzone ruins. And whenever you see shows around this, like Gordon Cooper, for example, supposedly from space saw all these Spanish galleons. No, I think he saw ruins of Atlantis, and this is the big secret. Again, it's that difference between what goes on publicly and what we can speak about versus things that are operational and inside circles. So you might ask yourself, well, what is it then? What happens? Why would they try to hide that there's ruins under the ocean? There's a lot of politics involved with this. And if we go into Egerton Sykes' work, who was the British intelligence officer, who was real expert on this and brought forward the best people to work on it. What he said is that everybody was involved in the Hotzone trying to figure that out. we got the term the hot zone from people who anonymously gave it to us as a tip originally. And the idea was that when I spoke to them, they were saying that there were areas that they would go in as part of contracting jobs for like mapping the ocean floor. And they would get into certain places and they would say, if you see anything, if you see large structures, for example, you cannot say anything publicly. And this is an NDA for you to sign. And by the way, you can be prosecuted for doing this. And if there were military people who were doing this, then you could be court-martialed, literally. So they go under there, and let's say they see like something like the Giza pyramid or something, and they're in that area, you know, say around the Bahamas, between the Bahamas and Cuba. They can't say anything about it. Now, I think this is very important because that got me thinking, well, you know, what is going on about this? But what I was able to collect in terms of information around it is that the zone, it was like too hot to handle, the idea was. They called it the hot zone. That's the area. And the crucial aspect of this is there's a number of different competing interests down there involved. And they're involved from Cuba, they're involved from Venezuela, they're involved from China, Russia, and America. So with all that going on, look, when you get into the hot zone, it's anybody's ballgame. You already have incredible drug wars going on down there. You already have remarkable smuggling, human trafficking, all kinds of things. So, you know, and you also have things being blocked from coming in from different ports and things of this nature. So it's an incredibly dynamic place anyway. But the deeper aspects that happen there have to do with this Atlantis search and the ruins search. And Zalitsky came right into the heart of it when she discovered the Cuban city. So this is what Lester was aware of. And this is the antecedent to all the things that we see happen with Epstein and Maxwell later. Remember the show that we did recently on Margaret Sanders, who was the daughter of Colonel Sanders. What was she doing? Well, she was working with Marvin Minsky and trying to get into all the past around Atlantis. What did she do? She started the Mars Group, and that is marine archaeological research. And that was all about finding Atlantis off Bimini. She was part of the Casey work, and her son was the pilot Trig Adams. And I've spoken to Trig, and Trig, you know, he was involved in finding the early ruins on Andros. That led to everyone searching and finding the Bimini Wall. So, you know, these people, there's a whole generational aspect of major families and people involved in this. And it's something that we don't hear about because the hot zone aspect was always the missing element. Now we have the hot zone piece. We understand, so it's a small group that can talk about it. The rest of everybody else is under NDA. They can't speak about it. That gives us a much better place to reason from. The Hemingway piece gives us a lot to reason from because we start to wonder, what would Hemingway have anything to do with Atlantis? And then if you go into the records at the ARE, you'll find Hemingway and Casey, the families were very close. So then it all starts to make sense. And why Ernest is there on Bimini and everything else makes a lot more sense than, hey, it's great fishing, which I'm sure it is. And, you know, that was definitely a benefit from it. But why would Stephen Hawking be there? Well, top secret inside Jeffrey Epstein's Orgy Island summit with Stephen Hawking. I don't think that Hawking was there for sexcapades. I think he's there for a totally different reason. And what we find out is that they specially fitted a submarine for Hawking when Epstein had him down there for the scientific summit. And they got some remarkable submarine for Hawking to go down there and observe these things with. This was not for ocean exploration, in my opinion, at all. If you go deep into it, we did a show. Okay, I'll get this in. The book is Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales. Reveals for the first time shocking details about Epstein's connection to the global academic and scientific elite. This is the piece that we're after if we can connect it with the Hotzone piece. That's what we can do. Authors Dylan Howard and Melissa Cronin found that in 2006, Epstein hosted a conference at the Ritz-Carlton at St. Thomas. We've exposed this conference in a few episodes. It attracted the likes of Stephen Hawking. During one night of the conference, guests were shuttled over to Little St. James for a barbecue and submarine tour. God knows what else. According to reports, the sub was custom fitted for Hawking's wheelchair. This is interesting too, because this is the Atlantis submarine that they're taking him down because they want him to go around and see these Hotzone artifacts. A photo of and also measure a magnetic anomaly going on there, which relates to the two-eyed stone and the apotheum piece. According to reports, the sub was custom fitted for Hawking's wheelchair. A photo of the event shows him being personally attended by a young blonde with her hair in a ponytail. I showed that picture earlier. Despite the tech luminaries who visited Little St. James, however, it was never really the hub of scientific pursuits for Epstein. Instead, Epstein cultivated scientific connections. 10,000-acre Zorro Ranch outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's the one with the very interesting Atlantis concentric circles in the background. Our important people were mostly scientists. Deidre Stratton, the woman tasked with recruiting young massage therapists for Epstein in New Mexico, revealed in Epstein Dead Men Tell No Tales. Jeffrey helped back their research. He would often have, like the guy who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the quark in quantum physics. She continued, a guy that won the Nobel Prize for a DNA discovery, people that helped to found Microsoft. Those were the kinds of people that were there, scientific and brilliant. They would have very erudite conversations over meals. You'd pick up a word here and there. Obviously, you couldn't really hear the whole thing, Stratton said. They would invite them to lunch with Ghislaine Maxwell. And Ghislaine would have this tablet, and she would write down the facts that they would tell them. So she's compiling from these conversations all these different things. At one point, she told me, when you get the information from an expert, then you get rid of them. Think of the mentality. This is how they think about it. They're looking for something. They're looking for some scientific piece to go along with their thing. They don't want that person engaged in their project. They don't want to let them in on all of it. They want their expertise and then get rid of them. As an agent of the Mossad, Epstein shared highly sensitive scientific developments with the Israeli government. For more chilling details, that's the book, Epstein, Dead Men Tell No Tales. That testimony alone is worth them doing that book. I don't know how accurate the whole book is, but what this woman had to say is fascinating because we get Ghislaine's mentality, which they want this expert. They want Cousteau, and they want to be able to pump out of her what her grandfather knew about the undersea terrain in relation to finding Atlantis. And then they want to be able to blackmail someone like that, just like they wanted to blackmail Marvin Minsky. They didn't get the chance to, according to Giuffre. But remember, Minsky was involved with Margaret Sanders, and Margaret Sanders was involved in finding Edgar Cayce's Atlantis. These are the pieces. This is the puzzle piece that's crucial when we consider the scientific track. That's how we'll get to the bottom of this. Everyone, okay. A couple of interesting Epstein notes. Remember Epstein now, 2003. What is he doing? He's sitting, meeting with Castro. What has Castro done? He's just discovered an entire Cuban city through Paulina Zalitsky, right off of his coast. And it's not just a few ruins spotty in there. It is actually in a whole metropolis. That's the way she described it. And she sent submersibles down. She's a submarine expert herself, just like Ghislaine is a submarine expert and submarine pilot. And so when she goes down there, reporters ask her, what did they see? And she said, I saw these hieroglyphs. And they were like Egyptian hieroglyphs? She said, no, they look like Mayan hieroglyphs. That's the stuff that they were seeing. So this culture, whatever it was, has everything involved with that, in common with that Mayan culture, but it's much older and it's underwater. So remember, again, Epstein, he's there in 2003. All right, the original Plato story talked about Atlantis set up in concentric circles. Okay, there's a depiction of Plato's story. Look at that. Think about those concentric circles. All right, Zorro Ranch. Are you ready? This is Epstein's ranch in New Mexico. look at this portion over here, or the concentric circles. That's something that he set up as a garden, but it looks exactly like Plato's Atlantis garden. Here's a close-up view. That's what we're talking about. Plato's concentric circle background, our friend Epstein's backyard in the Zorro Ranch. Zorro Ranch also had all kinds of figures of Poseidon, and the Atlantis imagery was thick, as it was also on Epstein Island. The submarine that he used to ferry all these scientists underwater to do God knows what is called the Atlantis submarine. That's it. Atlantis submarine ferrying people around for unknown scientific purposes underwater. This goes to Epstein's scientific program and also to Maxwell's Terramar project. They're operating in the hot zone with the top scientists in the world, and they have the cooperation of Castro, the whole gigantic plaza that Americans can't get at because it's off the coast of in Cuban waters. And they even threw out Polina Zalitsky because she had really come out and talked to the press and said, yeah, this is what I found. And they couldn't even block the story. Even the New York Times reported on it. Eventually, they just, hey, let's hope this thing peters out. Now, I want to do a quick update on this because when we get into what's happening there in the hot zone, something's come up which is in the Gulf of Mexico. And somebody called this the gumbo hot zone, which I thought was hilarious. But it's off the coast of Louisiana, right above the Yucatan, almost a straight line above it. And here's the story. Amateur archaeologists may have found an ancient city off the coast of St. Bernard. All I know is somebody built a city 12,000 years ago, and it stuck out in Chandeleur. These islands are uninhabited, and this guy has been on this story for decades. This is the story that's coming out. These things are coming up to the surface. And the things that he found, mystery 12,000-year-old underwater city with pyramids and energy field found off U.S. There are the Chandeleur Islands. Those are the headlines. Some of the headlines are screaming. And I noticed there's two versions of this story. One version where they take him seriously, and then the second version where they take the same exact story and they try to make him look foolish. Nonetheless, the guy's been working on it for 4 decades. And it seems very, very interesting. And I believe he's found the equivalent. He's kind of the modern day equivalent of Zalitsky's find 20 years previous. Archaeologist claims to have discovered a 12,000-year-old underwater city with pyramided energy field. That's the archaeologist. These are his claims. Off the coast of Louisiana, a retired architect claims to have discovered an ancient underwater city complete with pyramided energy field. George Gillet, an amateur archaeologist, has visited the ruins of a 12,000-year-old city 44 times. This isn't something that's an anomaly that just came up. He is seeing these ruins, and he's using sonar to figure out what's underneath. All right. Imagery is coming up around this. Some of the imagery is, he's saying these are large pyramids. And he's also saying that there's incredible effects, apotheum-style effects, Bermuda Triangle, magnetic disruption-style effects that are taking place in relation to this. So let's get our heads wrapped around this. I've been talking to you about land rising. We're going to discover these things. It's inevitable. And they're going to have problems blocking this story. So what they're going to have to do eventually is spin it. They're going to have to say, you know, oh, this was a culture, and, you know, they're going to have to change the human origin story. They're working on this already. If you look at the work that Gigi Young has been doing around Mars, the thing that Joseph Farrell is talking about in our interview from November about Mars, you're starting to get the idea that this is a totally different human origin story they need to bring forward, and Atlantis is at the core of it. This is the thing they've been able to keep off, and the mystery school said, this is important for us to know. It's something for us to have. We need that awareness before they spin it as something else. So remember the core principle of the whole thing. That's the hot zone. And it also runs down through the Caribbean. And, you know, that's Bimini here. And that's where the city was found off the western tip of Cuba. So here's the way I connect these dots. Epstein, in his search for the, because we have to remember that he's a eugenicist also, and this comes up often. But in their search, they've decided that they need these Atlantean artifacts, and they need that connection with the Belial, the original Belial cult. That's what the obsession is all about underwater. They're not interested in preserving oceans, but they are also aware of massive earth changes, and they're aware of this land rising piece. And everybody is positioning themselves on that level. They don't talk about it. They're not going to talk about it in scientific journals, but they are positioning themselves for this rise in land masses as other land masses sink. These are the earth changes. You hear all about the Casey earth changes map. Well, he was talking about earth changes taking place, certain areas going down, He said at one point Georgia and the Maine was going to have tremendous problems, and some of that was going to sink. And parts of Japan. Well, we're looking at Fukushima. There was another earthquake there 2 days ago. I mean, Japan has these incredible earthquakes plus the nuclear issues. So there's something very dynamic going on in the world there. If we don't understand the land rising piece and its associated Atlantean ruins, we're not going to get our heads wrapped around this properly. I do think the Hemingway family is deeply involved, or has been in the past, in the search for Atlantis. And I think they've come in, especially as a result of the activities of Ernest Hemingway, they've come in for some incredible deep state scrutiny. But one of the things we're also going to look at tonight is the CIA background and the CIA words of praise for Jack Hemingway, who was Ernest's son. And I find their entries on him in their own files quite enlightening and unusual. Let's take a quick look at the Bimini Wall. That's the wall there. This is what Casey predicted would rise in 1968. J. Manson Valentine was a diver, found it, was flying over Bimini, saw it, and suddenly the Bimini Wall became visible. It had never been visible before. So Casey had said it was the Temple of Poseidia, where the Hall of Records had been hidden. So there's been a lot of hubbub about the Bimini Wall, and what's quite unusual is there was actually a disaster, a hurricane, off of Bimini in 1926, and it was the position of the Casey Foundation that part of the Bimini Road had been removed at that time, which is very interesting because it supposedly wasn't even visible yet. So the rationale for that is quite interesting. I guess the real upshot of the whole thing with the Bimini Road or the Bimini Wall is that it's giving us this tie over with what the mystery schools were telling us about Atlantis rising and how that's going to impact the culture. For when this land rises off the east coast of America, it's going to send shockwaves through every type of institution that we have. And if it rises containing ruins from a former culture, as we've seen with the Bimini Road and with Paulina Zalitsky's find, then we know we're in deep. Then we're going deeper than ever. So we have to know that this is the period that we're in. And what's so funny to me is that as we've been doing this work around Atlantis, it seems this year is a prelude to so much coming out about Atlantis. And we see it even in popular culture and things like the Aquaman movie, which is coming up. That has a whole Atlantis theme. And
Bo Krill's just saw that, by the way.
oh, did he really? So it's already out. Okay.
I don't know how it is. Let us know.
Yes, tell us all about it. I remember the comic book as a kid. But what was it that Casey was trying to tell us here? What were we getting from Edgar Casey's Bimini readings? He was trying to tell us that an advanced civilization that was advanced spiritually fell apart because it had two factions, the Emilius faction, followers of one, and the Belial faction, the Ahrimanic faction. The Emilius group used the technology to interface with higher spiritual beings. They would get information from, quote, the outer spheres and the beings in the outer spheres. And the Belial group basically used it and used the incredible power of death rays and the laser ability of this to dominate the landmass, and they became more and more materialistic in that sense. And that at a certain point, as a result of this, that great continent split into 3 islands, and that the island of Poseidia became the island predominantly of the Emilius group fighting this dominant group. Now, what's funny is the Belial group would saturate the Emilius group, so that at a certain point, the Emilius group had to take themselves back as initiates and keep themselves separate from the Belial group. And we see so many echoes of this in the Bible and in these other cultures, where this group is staying aside from everyone else and saying, we have to move this information into these secret channels. And you see later with a lot of the schools like the Essenes and with these different mystery school traditions, that there's this idea that we're going to maintain this knowledge and we're going to keep it purified, basically. Because apparently at the time, the Belial groups had really polluted the spiritual stream of the information. Okay, one of the interesting things that Zalitsky found down there is quite unusual, and you can't make much of it here, but I wanted to show it anyway because I showed the ruins. But a lot of people have made this comparison of this face underwater. And it is hard to see, but it's one of these, it's almost like the face on Mars type thing. There's a lot of anomalies in her visual work around this. And I think this could be part of the problem and the mystery, that if you have these developed cities and you have these faces carved and these sphinxes and stuff, there's just no denying it. You can't say, well, it's an anomaly, like the media has tried to pass off since her original find has been discovered and announced. They've been saying, well, maybe that was just some stuff from the Cold War and missile silos and stuff. It's just an anomaly. And, the theme that they drove home in article after article was anomaly, or no, Atlantis or anomaly. And I found that quite amusing, because you could see it was coming down from the top of whoever was controlling the media, saying, let's use this headline whenever we address this particular thing. So they have a big problem, the people who are trying to protect the secret, which is so much of it is out. The reason it's out is because the mystery schools guaranteed us a place at the table by telling us about it as far back as the 19th century. And, certainly earlier with people like Sir Francis Bacon, but in terms of a truly broad push into society, let's look at one of those broad pushes, and it is when Ignatius Donnelly wrote this book, which is Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. We can see here that this version, published in the 1950s, says edited by Egerton Sykes, and it's a modern revised edition. Now, Sykes became such a well-known Atlantis scholar that everybody wanted him to do his work. So Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which was Ignatius Donnelly's masterpiece on Atlantis from the 19th century, that's not something you give the forward to just anybody. He has to be somebody who's really well reputed within the whole community. So this is the person that they gave it to. Now, Donnelly himself is a very unusual figure. There in Minnesota, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, comes out in 1882 and definitely shakes things up. He goes into how the languages are similar with these cultures, the Maya and the Egyptian, and he basically puts a lot of this on display for the first time. But what's happened before that is that the Theosophical Society has come out with information regarding Atlantis. But this wave that's coming up there in the 19th century, being pushed through mystical figures like Blavatsky and Steiner, being pushed through political figures like Ignatius Donnelly, we have to ask ourselves, where is that coming from? And again, we go back to that mystery school influence, because they want us to have the ability to fight this kind of large-scale misinformation scheme about our past, one. And two, I think it's also important to remember with the mystery schools that they want to give us the tools without directly interfering. So that's a tricky line to walk very often. One of the things that I remind everyone about when it comes to the mystery schools is that Rudolf Steiner had said, look, in 1840, they made a decision. Scientific materialism was taking over. It's coming out of Germany, scientific circles largely. But it was going to reduce everything to what could be measured physically, which is a disaster for the evolution of humanity. And Steiner said they came into a clash where some groups wanted to let information out to the public regarding Atlantis, regarding subjects like reincarnation, psychic development, the real origins of humanity, and also those who wanted to hold back and said, you know what, we've been holding these secrets. We'll continue to help humanity from the sidelines, but we're not worried about it. But there's certain enlightened group within those mystery schools, according to Steiner, C.G. Harrison, and some others, decided, well, this is serious, because in 100 years, humanity, we're not even going to be able to recognize humanity. There'll be no helping them. So we have to let this information out. And they did. And apparently it was just a small percentage of the mystery schools that started this. And when they let it out, it was pretty rocky road, frankly. Spiritualism exploded out of this movement. And the spiritualism became trivial. It became almost like a board game, like a Ouija board game. So the knowledge was kicked in there that there was this other world, but it became a trivialization. And one of the things that came out of that is the mystery schools withdrew from that effort and the people who were doing it. And the people of that period, like the Fox sisters and the Poughkeepsie Seer, Andrew Jackson Davis, they are the representatives of this push and this movement, because the mystery schools had looked out and said, we can use some of these people to try this out with, because they either have the right past life ability and training, or there's something about them and their spiritual psychic function that we can use. Now, we know from Emma Britton, who came forward and told us about the Orphic Circle, that these groups that were in London at the time were spotlighting and looking for these young adults that they could use in these psychic programs in order to find state secrets. They would turn them into somnambulists and get information on, the nature of reality and all sorts of metaphysical occult questions, but they could also use them for political questions. So this is kind of an important thing for us to keep in mind, that when we get into this side of it, and we're thinking about what the mystery schools are doing, this is something that goes on in these groups and something that we don't see in public, because it's a great ability that humanity has to be able to tap these powers, so that if they can trivialize it in popular culture, if they can make the psychic aspect, the reincarnation aspect, the spiritual aspect more of, seem like something that is completely impractical and not real, then they basically take away your only ability to get out of, get away from being under their thumb. So I think this is the kind of way we have to look at how these things are portrayed to us, and how we need to reinterpret what intuitive ability is, what psychic ability is. So when we are doing this aspect of the extegonography series, we're looking at it and we're saying, you need psychic archaeology, you need intuitive viewing in order to understand what the mystery schools are. And you need to understand, if you're going to understand the deep state, you have to understand what the mystery schools are. So you cannot trust it to just political analysis. You can't trust it to just financial analysis. If we had a great guest on right now who was a master of the Federal Reserve, we'd learn so much about history and how the money works. That's important. It's a major function. But you need all the pieces. If you don't have the mystery school forces and that understanding behind why this drives the deep state battles, then you'll never really understand what's going on behind the scenes. Just like we'll be in the dark when it comes to this Atlantis rising thing, if we don't get behind the evidence that's out there, if we don't understand the forces that were pushing public figures like the Hemingways and the Kennedys around on this issue. So a lot of these things, when we see the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we see the battle over Cuba, the insane battle to get power over Cuba, and how so much of that is driven by this deep state covert wing, and these invisible powers, that we can't even get our hands on, we start to get an idea that it's deeper than just geopolitical interests. They're fighting for survival and they're fighting for dominance. And if we don't understand things like Atlantis rising or the UFO file, I might as well just throw that in there, right? We're so far out on a limb. If we don't understand these things, then we're not understanding the elements that are causing the wars, the elements that are causing the stress, the elements that are causing the manipulation and the secrecy, most importantly. So we can get the transparency by apprehending these things that are available to us. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we go into this next section. And as I go there, Miss Olivia,